December 16th, 1985. Manhattan's East Side. Snow falls on 46th Street as two men in long coats step out of a black Lincoln. Paul Castellano, boss of America's most powerful crime family, walks towards Sparks Steakhouse. He never makes it through the door. 3 gunmen appear from the shadows. 6 shots. The most powerful mobster in America falls dead on the sidewalk, his blood mixing with the winter slush. But this story doesn't start in Manhattan. It doesn't start with headlines or FBI raids or restaurant assassinations. It starts 40 years earlier, in the poorest villages of Sicily, where a young boy named Carlo Gambino learned a lesson that would build an empire. Silence is more powerful than violence. Tonight, we're diving into a century of secrets. The rise of America's most powerful crime dynasty. From Sicilian olive groves to New York skyscrapers. From invisible power to tabloid infamy. This is the story nobody tells you in the movies. Dim the lights. Get comfortable. This is the entire history of the Gambino family. Let's begin where it all started. Sicily, 1900. At the turn of the 20th century, Sicily was dying. Not the Sicily you see in travel brochures today, with its azure coastlines and ancient ruins. The Sicily of 1900 was a place of desperate poverty, brutal landlords, and a government that existed only to extract taxes and conscript young men into wars they didn't understand. In the hills outside Palermo, farmers worked land they would never own. They planted crops that landlords would sell. They watched their children go hungry, while grain ships left Sicilian ports bound for northern Italy and beyond. The Italian government, unified only 40 years earlier, viewed Sicily not as a partner, but as a colony to be exploited. This was the world that created La Cosa Nostra, our thing, what Americans would later call the mafia. The word itself is older than most people realize. Some historians trace it to Arabic, from Sicily's centuries under Muslim rule. Others say it comes from an old Sicilian phrase meaning act like a man or simply courage. But by 1900, everyone in Sicily knew what it meant. The mafia wasn't just a criminal organization. It was a parallel government, a system of justice when the official system offered none, a way of protecting your family when the police protected only the wealthy. In the town of Passo di Rigano, just outside Palermo, the Gambino family worked the land like thousands of others. They were nobody special, no different from countless families grinding out survival in Sicily's interior. They grew olives and almonds. They paid their rent to landlords who lived in Palermo's grand palazzos. They survived. On August 24th, 1902, a boy was born to the Gambino family. They named him Carlo. Carlo Gambino grew up watching. He was small for his age, quiet, observant. While other boys fought and shouted, Carlo learned to listen. He watched how the local mafia bosses moved through town, how they settled disputes, how they commanded respect without raising their voices, how they built power through favors and debts rather than through violence alone. Sicily's mafia families operated on a code older than the Italian state itself. Omertà, they called it. The code of silence. You didn't cooperate with authorities. You didn't testify in court. You settled your problems privately, within the system. Violation meant death, not from the government, but from your own people. This code made sense in a place where the government was the enemy, where police served landlords and tax collectors, where justice for poor Sicilians simply didn't exist. The mafia filled that void. They arbitrated disputes. They enforced contracts. They protected communities from bandits and corrupt officials. Of course, they also extorted money, controlled markets, and murdered anyone who challenged them. But in the moral calculus of survival in Sicily, they were often the lesser evil. Young Carlo absorbed all of this. He understood something fundamental. Power doesn't come from being the strongest or the loudest. It comes from knowing things, from being indispensable, from making yourself the person everyone needs. By the time Carlo was a teenager, World War I had devastated Italy. Hundreds of thousands of young Italian men died in mountain trenches fighting Austria-Hungary. Sicily, as always, provided more than its share of cannon fodder. When the war ended in 1918, the Italian economy collapsed. Inflation destroyed savings. Jobs disappeared. The government offered nothing. But there was another Italy, one across the ocean. For decades, Sicilians had been leaving for America. The first great wave started in the 1880s. By 1900, over 4 million Italians had crossed the Atlantic. They sent letters home describing a place where even poor men could eat meat every day, where labor was valued, where you could own land without centuries of birthright. Of course, the reality was more complicated. Italian immigrants faced discrimination, violence, and exploitation in America. They lived in crowded tenements, worked dangerous jobs for low wages, and were viewed by many Americans as racially inferior, prone to crime and anarchy. But compared to Sicily, America was paradise. Carlo Gambino made his decision sometime around 1920. The exact details are murky, lost to time, and deliberate obscurity. What we know is this. In December of 1921, a 19-year-old Carlo Gambino arrived in Norfolk, Virginia, aboard a freight ship called the SS Vincenzo Florio. He didn't arrive through Ellis Island like millions of legal immigrants. He arrived as a stowaway, hidden in the cargo hold, smuggled past immigration authorities. Even then, Carlo understood that being invisible had advantages. No paperwork, no record, no government file tracking his movements. He made his way north to New York City, to Brooklyn, to a neighborhood called Bensonhurst, where thousands of Sicilian immigrants had recreated the villages they'd left behind. Same dialects, same food, same social structures, and, inevitably, the same criminal organizations. Carlo Gambino arrived in New York with nothing but the clothes on his back and the lessons he'd learned in Sicily. He was 19 years old, barely spoke English, and had no legal right to be in the country. Within 3 decades, he would control the most powerful criminal organization in America. But first, he had to survive Prohibition. The New York that Carlo Gambino entered in 1921 was unlike anything he'd seen in Sicily. Brooklyn alone held more people than all of Palermo province. Buildings stretched toward the sky in ways that defied imagination. Electric lights turned night into day. Automobiles crowded streets that just 20 years earlier had been filled with horses. The noise, the speed, the sheer density of humanity, it was overwhelming. But beneath the surface chaos, Carlo recognized something familiar. The same structures he'd known in Sicily existed here, transplanted and transformed. The mafia had come to America. Bensonhurst in the 1920s was essentially a Sicilian village reconstructed in Brooklyn. Men gathered in social clubs to drink espresso and play cards. Women shopped at Italian grocers and bakeries. Children grew up speaking Sicilian at home and English in the streets. And just like in Sicily, there were men who commanded respect, who settled disputes, who controlled certain businesses and territories. Carlo moved in with distant relatives and took whatever work he could find. Construction, loading docks, the backbreaking labor that immigrants did while established Americans looked down on them. But Carlo wasn't building a career in legitimate work. He was watching, listening, making connections. He joined a crew run by the D'Aquila crime family, one of several mafia groups operating in New York at the time. The work was simple at first: collecting gambling debts, providing muscle for local businesses that paid for protection, running numbers. Carlo proved reliable, discreet, and crucially, he never talked too much. Then came January 17th, 1920. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution took effect, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. Prohibition, they called it. The noble experiment. It would last 13 years and transform organized crime in America forever. Think about what Prohibition actually meant. The government had just made illegal something that millions of Americans desperately wanted. Alcohol wasn't heroin or cocaine, something only a small percentage of the population craved. It was beer and wine and whiskey, consumed by virtually every adult in the country. Overnight, one of the largest industries in America became criminal enterprise. The profits were staggering. A case of whiskey that cost $4 to smuggle from Canada sold for $60 in New York speakeasies. The markup was often 1,500%. Millions of dollars flowed through the hands of anyone who could supply the demand, and the Italian mafia families were perfectly positioned to capitalize. By the mid-1920s, multiple mafia families operated in New York: the D'Aquilas, the Morellos, the Masseria family, the Reina family, the Profaci family. Each controlled different territories, different rackets, different revenue streams, and increasingly they fought each other for control. Carlo Gambino worked under Salvatore D'Aquila initially, but when D'Aquila was murdered in 1928, Carlo shifted his loyalty to Joe Masseria, known as Joe the Boss. Masseria was one of the most powerful mafia bosses in New York, controlling bootlegging operations, gambling, and labor racketeering throughout Manhattan and Brooklyn. But Masseria had enemies. Chief among them was Salvatore Maranzano, a Sicilian mafia boss who'd arrived in America in 1925. Maranzano was different from most of the rough, barely educated gangsters who dominated the New York underworld. He was cultured, well-read, spoke multiple languages, and fancied himself a student of Julius Caesar and ancient Roman military tactics. Maranzano believed the American mafia was too chaotic, too disorganized. He wanted to restructure it along the lines of the Roman legions, with clear hierarchies, territories, and rules. Masseria, older and more traditional, saw Maranzano as an upstart and a threat. What followed was the Castellamorese War, named after the Sicilian town many of Maranzano's followers came from. From 1929 to 1931, the two factions waged a brutal conflict across New York. Dozens of men were murdered. Businesses were bombed. Restaurants became war zones. Carlo Gambino found himself caught in the middle, working for Masseria, but smart enough to see which way the wind was blowing. Several of Masseria's own men, including an ambitious young gangster named Lucky Luciano, secretly believed their boss was going to lose. Maranzano had more men, better organization, and crucially, younger allies who understood that the old Sicilian ways needed to evolve for the American context. On April 15, 1931, Joe Masseria went to lunch at a restaurant in Coney Island. He was accompanied by Lucky Luciano. After they ate, Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. 4 gunmen entered. Masseria died in a hail of bullets, slumped over a table still covered with the remains of his meal. Luciano had betrayed his boss. The Castellamorese War was effectively over. Maranzano had won, but Maranzano's victory lasted only months. He immediately set himself up as boss of all bosses, the supreme leader of the New York Mafia. He restructured the various gangs into 5 distinct families, each with its own territory and leadership. This is the structure that still exists today, nearly a century later. The 5 families were the Bonanno family, the Colombo family, the Genovese family, the Lucchese family, and the family led by Vincent Mangano, which would eventually become the Gambino family. But Maranzano's attempt to crown himself supreme boss didn't sit well with the younger generation of mobsters. Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and others believed the boss of all bosses concept was outdated, that it made one man too powerful and too obvious a target for law enforcement. They wanted a more democratic structure, a commission where the family bosses met as equals. On September 10, 1931, less than 5 months after Masseria's murder, Salvatore Maranzano was killed in his own office in Manhattan. The killers posed as police officers. Maranzano was stabbed and shot repeatedly. Within hours, dozens of Maranzano's top allies across the country were murdered in a coordinated purge. It became known as the Night of the Sicilian Vespers, named after a medieval massacre in Sicily. The old guard was wiped out. The young generation took control. Lucky Luciano emerged as the most powerful figure in the New York Mafia, though he carefully avoided calling himself boss of all bosses. Instead, he created the Commission, a ruling council where the heads of the 5 families met to resolve disputes, divide territories, and agree on rules. It was, in its way, a criminal constitution. Through all of this violence and upheaval, Carlo Gambino survived. He had backed Masseria, but not loudly. He had worked under Maranzano briefly, but without commitment, and when the dust settled, he found himself in the Mangano family, working under Vincent Mangano as a loyal soldier. Carlo was 29 years old. He'd been in America for 10 years. He'd survived 2 major mafia wars without picking the wrong side too publicly. He'd made connections across multiple families. And most importantly, he'd learned the most valuable lesson of all in the criminal underworld. The loudest voice in the room usually gets killed first. The quiet one survives. Carlo Gambino would stay quiet for another 26 years before making his move. But when he did, he would build an empire more powerful than Masseria or Maranzano or even Lucky Luciano could have imagined. The foundation was laid. Now came the patient climb to power. Carlo Gambino understood something that most ambitious men never learn. Patience is a weapon. While other mobsters fought for attention, for territory, for the boss's ear, Carlo simply worked. He showed up. He followed orders. He never complained. And most crucially, he never made himself a target. The 1930s were difficult years for organized crime. Prohibition ended in 1933, eliminating the greatest source of illegal revenue the mafia had ever known. Overnight, the speakeasies closed, the smuggling routes dried up, and gangsters who'd made millions had to find new rackets. But the mafia adapted. They always did. The 5 families diversified. They moved deeper into labor unions, controlling the docks, the garment district, the trucking industry. They ran illegal gambling operations, numbers, rackets, loan sharking. They extorted businesses through protection schemes. And they invested their dirty money into legitimate enterprises, buying restaurants, bars, construction companies, and real estate. Carlo worked for Vincent Mangano, the boss of what was then called the Mangano family. Vincent was old-school Sicilian, traditional and cautious. His underboss was a man named Albert Anastasia, and the relationship between them was complicated from the start. Albert Anastasia was everything Carlo Gambino was not. Where Carlo was quiet, Albert was loud. Where Carlo was patient, Albert was impulsive. Where Carlo avoided violence when possible, Albert seemed to relish it. He earned the nickname the Lord High Executioner for his willingness to kill, and later, the Mad Hatter for his unpredictable brutality. Anastasia had connections to one of the most notorious operations in mafia history, Murder Incorporated. Murder Inc., as the press called it, was essentially a contract killing service run by the mafia families. Based in Brooklyn, it was staffed primarily by Jewish and Italian gangsters who carried out hits for money. If a family boss in Chicago needed someone eliminated, he could contact Murder Inc. Professional killers would be dispatched, men with no connection to the victim, no obvious motive, making the crime nearly impossible to solve. Albert Anastasia was deeply involved in Murder Inc. His operations throughout the 1930s and early 40s. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of murders were carried out under his direction. Bodies turned up in alleys, in car trunks, in the rivers. The police knew what was happening but couldn't prove it. The killers were professionals. They left no witnesses. Carlo Gambino watched all of this carefully. He saw how Anastasia's violence made him powerful but also made him enemies. Carlo took a different path. He became indispensable through competence rather than fear. He married his cousin, Catherine Gambino, in 1932, strengthening family ties and presenting himself as a traditional family man. He bought a modest house in Brooklyn. He was seen at church. He kept his name out of the newspapers. While other mobsters drove Cadillacs and wore expensive suits, Carlo dressed like a middle-class businessman. He became invisible in plain sight. But behind this ordinary facade, Carlo was building something. A network of loyalty. He did favors for other families. He mediated disputes. He proved trustworthy with sensitive information. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he became someone that everyone in the New York underworld knew and respected. The 1940s brought World War II, and with it, new opportunities. The New York docks became crucial for the war effort. Ships carrying supplies to Europe passed through constantly. The government, desperate to prevent sabotage and Nazi infiltration, needed the cooperation of the men who actually controlled the waterfront. The longshoremen, the union bosses, the mafia, Lucky Luciano, imprisoned since 1936, allegedly cut a deal with naval intelligence. In exchange for mafia cooperation in protecting the docks, his sentence would eventually be reduced. Whether this arrangement actually happened remains debated, but what's certain is that the mafia tightened its grip on New York's waterfront during the war years, and Carlo Gambino was deeply involved in dock operations. After the war, the American economy boomed. Soldiers returned home, babies were born, suburbs expanded, and the mafia families, flush with wartime profits, expanded with them. They moved into construction, garbage collection, trucking, and food distribution. Anywhere that required union labor or government contracts, mafia influence followed. But within the Mangano family, tensions were building. Vincent Mangano and Albert Anastasia hated each other. The exact reasons remain murky, lost to history and deliberate secrecy, but the conflict was real. Vincent, the boss, increasingly saw Albert as a threat. Albert, the underboss, chafed under Vincent's leadership and believed he could run the family better. On April 19, 1951, Vincent Mangano disappeared, simply vanished. His car was found abandoned. His brother Philip's body was discovered days later, shot 3 times. But Vincent, never found. No body, no trace. Everyone knew Albert Anastasia had killed him. There was no trial, no investigation that went anywhere. This was a mafia matter, settled mafia style. The commission, the ruling body of family bosses, met to discuss the situation. Anastasia claimed Vincent had been planning to kill him, that he'd acted in self-defense. The commission, not wanting another war, accepted this explanation. Albert Anastasia became the boss. The family was effectively his now, though it still carried the Mangano name for a time. And Carlo Gambino became the underboss. This was the moment Carlo had been waiting 20 years for. Not the top position, not yet, but close enough to see everything, to influence everything, while remaining just outside the brightest spotlight. Anastasia ruled through fear. He was violent, unpredictable, and increasingly paranoid. He ordered hits on people who'd disrespected him, who'd looked at him wrong, who'd simply irritated him. His brutality kept people in line but also made him deeply unpopular, even within his own family. Carlo, as underboss, played a different role. He was reasonable, calm. When Anastasia screamed, Carlo listened patiently and then quietly cleaned up the mess. When Anastasia wanted to kill someone over a minor slight, Carlo suggested alternatives. He became the family's diplomat, its administrator, its voice of reason. And quietly, very quietly, he built alliances with other families. With Vito Genovese, with Carlo Gambino's cousin Paul Castellano, who was rising through the ranks, with the Lucchese family, with people who were tired of Anastasia's chaos. By the mid-1950s, Albert Anastasia had made too many enemies. His violence had become a liability. His unpredictability made him dangerous to work with. And his increasingly public profile, his expensive lifestyle, his appearances in newspapers, all of it violated the old principle of staying invisible. The commission began discussing what to do about Albert Anastasia. Behind closed doors, in conversations never recorded, in meetings never acknowledged, a consensus formed. Anastasia had to go. Carlo Gambino never publicly advocated for his boss's murder. That wasn't his style, but he didn't need to. He simply made it clear that he wouldn't object, that he wouldn't seek revenge, that he would accept whatever the commission decided. On the morning of October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia walked into the barber shop of the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. It was his regular spot. He sat in the barber's chair, a white cloth draped over him, his face lathered with shaving cream. 2 men entered. They wore scarves over their faces. They walked directly to Anastasia's chair. They opened fire. Anastasia tried to stand, tried to fight, but he was trapped in the barber chair, blinded by shaving cream, wrapped in cloth. He lunged toward the mirror, perhaps seeing the reflection of his killers, perhaps simply trying to escape. Bullets tore through him. He collapsed on the barbershop floor, his blood mixing with hair clippings and shaving cream. The killers walked out calmly. They disappeared into the Manhattan crowds. They were never caught. The barbershop murder became instantly famous, one of the most iconic mafia hits in history. Photos of the scene, of Anastasia's body sprawled on the tile floor, ran in newspapers across the country. It shocked Americans, this brazen execution in the middle of a busy Manhattan hotel, but in the mafia world, it was simply business. Within days, the commission met. They needed to appoint a new boss for the Mangano family. The choice was obvious. Carlo Gambino, the loyal underboss, the quiet one, the diplomat, the man everyone trusted. At 55 years old, 36 years after arriving in America as a penniless stowaway, Carlo Gambino became the boss of New York's most powerful crime family. And in recognition of his leadership, the family name changed. No longer the Mangano family. From that day forward, it would be known as the Gambino family. Carlo had reached the top, but he wasn't interested in glory or headlines or being famous. He wanted something more valuable than fame. He wanted absolute power exercised invisibly. And for the next 19 years, that's exactly what he built. 3 weeks after Albert Anastasia's murder, the mafia held a meeting that would change everything. On November 14, 1957, over 100 mafia bosses, underbosses, and high-ranking members from across the United States gathered at the rural estate of Joseph Barbara in Appalachian, New York. They came from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, California, even Cuba. It was meant to be a summit, a chance for the commission to discuss business, resolve disputes, and coordinate activities. It was also supposed to be secret, but a local police officer noticed the unusual number of expensive cars with out-of-state plates converging on Barbara's property. He called for backup. State police set up roadblocks. When the mobsters realized they were surrounded, many fled into the woods, abandoning their cars, ruining their expensive suits scrambling through the forest. Over 60 men were detained and questioned. The police couldn't charge most of them with anything specific, but they collected names, took photos, documented connections. For the first time, law enforcement had concrete proof of a national organized crime network. The Appalachian Meeting, as it became known, was a public relations disaster for the mafia. Carlo Gambino was there. He was detained, questioned, and released. But the experience reinforced a lesson he already knew. Visibility is dangerous. For the next 2 decades, Carlo Gambino would run the most powerful crime family in America while remaining almost completely invisible. He gave no interviews. He avoided photographers. He lived in a modest house in Brooklyn, drove ordinary cars, dressed in plain suits. To anyone watching, he looked like a retired shopkeeper, not the boss of a criminal empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But make no mistake, Carlo Gambino was the most powerful mobster in America. His family controlled the New York waterfront, where every piece of cargo that moved through the docks paid tribute. They controlled the garment district, where every dress manufacturer paid protection money. They controlled construction unions, garbage collection, trucking companies, and food distribution networks. They ran gambling operations across the city and loaned money at interest rates that would make modern payday lenders blush. Conservative estimates suggest the Gambino family's annual revenue in the 1960s exceeded $50 million. In today's money, that's over $400 million per year. And that's just the family's cut. The total money flowing through Gambino-controlled rackets was exponentially higher. Carlo's philosophy of leadership was simple: maximize profit, minimize attention. He avoided violence when possible. Dead bodies attracted police attention. Better to intimidate, to threaten, to make people understand that cooperation was cheaper than resistance. When violence was necessary, Carlo made sure it was surgical, precise. One target, one message, no innocent casualties to generate public outcry. He diversified the family's income. While other families relied heavily on a few rackets, Carlo spread the risk. If one operation got hit by law enforcement, 10 others continued generating money. He was, in many ways, running the Gambino family like a Fortune 500 company, with multiple revenue streams, clear hierarchies, and long-term strategic planning. And he was obsessively careful about electronic surveillance. The FBI, under Director J. Edgar Hoover, was becoming increasingly sophisticated. They developed new wiretapping techniques, planted bugs in social clubs, and recorded conversations. Many mobsters, comfortable in their power, spoke freely about criminal activities over the phone or in rooms they assumed were private. Not Carlo. He never discussed business over the telephone. Never. His capos knew that meetings happened in person, often while walking on the street where hidden microphones couldn't reach. He spoke in code, in vague references, in implications rather than direct statements. Even when FBI agents managed to plant listening devices near him, they captured almost nothing useful. He was, one FBI agent later recalled, like trying to nail smoke to the wall. Carlo also understood the importance of political connections. The mafia had always corrupted police officers and low-level officials, but Carlo aimed higher. Through carefully laundered campaign contributions, through union support, through construction companies that built civic projects, the Gambino family developed relationships with judges, congressmen, and city officials. These connections provided early warnings about investigations, favorable rulings in court cases, and the ability to operate with a degree of impunity. Carlo never met these officials directly. Everything was handled through intermediaries, through lawyers, through legitimate businessmen who were secretly on the Gambino payroll. The connections were real, but proving them was nearly impossible. The 1960s brought new challenges. The FBI created specialized organized crime task forces. Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, made destroying the mafia a personal crusade. New laws gave prosecutors more tools. Electronic surveillance became more sophisticated. Witness protection programs made it safer for people to testify. But Carlo adapted. He promoted men who were intelligent, who understood business, who could operate in the changing environment. He pushed the family deeper into legitimate businesses, buying restaurants, construction companies, and real estate. He made it harder to distinguish between legal and illegal operations. One of his most trusted associates was his cousin and brother-in-law, Paul Castellano. Paul was different from the typical street mobster. He was educated, business-minded, comfortable with numbers and contracts. Carlo groomed him carefully, giving him control over lucrative operations, teaching him how to think strategically. But Carlo also understood that running a crime family required more than just business acumen. It required respect from the soldiers, the men who did the actual work on the streets. And for that, he cultivated relationships with tough guys, with traditional mobsters who commanded fear. One of those men was Aniello Della Croce, who became Carlo's underboss. Della Croce, whose name meant Little Lamb of the Cross, was anything but gentle. He was a fierce, old-school gangster who'd killed men with his own hands, who commanded absolute loyalty from the crews under him. Where Paul Castellano represented the family's business future, Della Croce represented its violent past. Carlo balanced them perfectly. Paul handled the money operations, the legitimate businesses, the strategic planning. Della Croce handled enforcement, disputes, and keeping the street soldiers happy. Carlo stood above both, orchestrating everything. The 1970s brought the beginning of the end for many mafia families. The RICO Act, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed in 1970. For the first time, prosecutors could charge the entire leadership of a criminal organization, not just individuals for specific crimes. They could use patterns of behavior, conspiracy charges, and the testimony of lower-ranking members to take down entire families. Carlo saw it coming. He became even more careful, even more insulated. He promoted people who were smart enough to avoid creating evidence. He distanced himself further from day-to-day operations. He became a ghost, a name whispered in social clubs, a figure everyone knew, controlled everything but no one could prove anything against. In 1973, Carlo was called to testify before a grand jury investigating organized crime. He appeared, answered questions in monosyllables, claimed poor memory, and revealed nothing. Prosecutors were furious but helpless. They knew he was lying, knew he was guilty of countless crimes, but they couldn't prove it. By the mid-1970s, Carlo Gambino was in his 70s. He'd been the boss for nearly 20 years. He'd survived when dozens of other mobsters had been killed or imprisoned. He'd built the Gambino family into the most powerful criminal organization in America, and he'd done it all while remaining virtually invisible to the public. But age catches everyone, even Carlo Gambino. His health deteriorated. He suffered from heart problems, diabetes, and the general wear of 70-plus years of stress and secrecy. He began thinking about succession, about who would lead the family after he was gone. He had a choice to make. The traditional path would be to promote his underboss, Aniello Della Croce. Della Croce was respected, feared, and had earned the position. The soldiers loved him. It would be the safe choice, the one that honored tradition. But Carlo didn't choose Della Croce. He chose Paul Castellano, his cousin, his brother-in-law, the businessman, the man who understood that the future of organized crime was in legitimate businesses, in white-collar crime, in operations that looked legal on paper. It was a controversial decision. Many in the family were angry. They saw it as nepotism, as Carlo choosing family over merit. Della Croce was furious, but, loyal to Carlo, accepted the decision. He would remain underboss, but Paul would be boss. Carlo explained his reasoning to those close enough to hear it. The world was changing. The old ways, the street-level violence and obvious criminality were dying. The FBI was too sophisticated now. The RICO Act had changed the rules. The future belonged to men who could operate businesses, who could move money invisibly, who could make crime look like legitimate commerce. Paul Castellano, Carlo believed, was that future. It was a miscalculation that would eventually destroy the family. But Carlo wouldn't live to see it. On October 15th, 1976, Carlo Gambino died of a heart attack at his home in Brooklyn. He was 74 years old. He died in his bed, surrounded by family, never having spent a single day in prison for his crimes. His funeral was a spectacle. Thousands attended. The FBI photographed everyone, documenting the entire hierarchy of multiple crime families in one place. It was the largest gathering of mobsters since Appalachian, and this time it was completely legal. They were just attending a funeral. Carlo Gambino was buried in a cemetery in Brooklyn, his grave marked with a simple headstone. No grand monument, no ostentatious display. Even in death, he remained understated. The newspapers called him the Godfather, comparing him to the fictional character from Mario Puzo's novel and Francis Ford Coppola's film. The comparison was apt. Like Vito Corleone, Carlo had ruled through intelligence rather than violence, through patience rather than impulse, through invisibility rather than fame. He'd come to America 55 years earlier with nothing. He'd survived wars, betrayals, investigations, and the constant threat of prison or death. He'd built an empire that generated hundreds of millions of dollars. He'd controlled unions, businesses, and politicians. He'd been the most powerful mobster in America for 2 decades. And he'd never given an interview, never been photographed willingly, never made himself the center of attention. Paul Castellano inherited all of that. The power, the wealth, the respect, the invisible empire that Carlo had spent a lifetime building. But Paul wasn't Carlo. He didn't understand the streets the way Carlo had. He didn't balance tradition and innovation the way Carlo had. And he didn't see the danger growing within his own family. A young capo named John Gotti was watching, waiting, ambitious. The golden age was over. The age of headlines was about to begin. Paul Castellano became boss of the Gambino family in October 1976, and almost immediately, the problems began. Paul was 61 years old, wealthy beyond measure, and completely disconnected from the world his soldiers inhabited. Where Carlo Gambino had lived in a modest Brooklyn home, Paul built himself a mansion. Not just any mansion, a 17-room, 3-story Georgian-style estate on Tot Hill in Staten Island, the highest point in New York City. It cost $3.5 million, equivalent to over $18 million today. The family called it the White House. It was visible for miles, ostentatious and impossible to ignore. Everything Carlo had taught about staying invisible, Paul seemed determined to contradict. Inside, the mansion was decorated like a European palace. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, imported furniture. Paul had a swimming pool, a library, and security systems more sophisticated than most corporate headquarters. He entertained there, held meetings in his study, conducted Gambino family business from a throne that might as well have had a spotlight on it. The FBI loved it. They set up surveillance posts with clear views of everyone who came and went. They photographed cars, documented meetings, and built files on the entire Gambino hierarchy. Paul had essentially built them a permanent observation platform, but the mansion was just a symptom of a deeper problem. Paul Castellano didn't think like a mob boss. He thought like a corporate executive. He'd made his fortune in legitimate businesses, particularly in the meat industry and construction. He owned a company called Dial Poultry, which supplied chicken to restaurants across New York. Through a combination of union control and strategic partnerships, Dial Poultry had become enormously profitable. Paul expanded into other food distribution, into construction supply companies, into businesses that looked completely legal on paper, but were backed by Gambino family muscle. This was exactly what Carlo had envisioned, the evolution of organized crime into corporate crime, but Paul took it too far. He became so focused on the white-collar operations that he neglected the street-level rackets that had always been the family's foundation. Worse, he distanced himself from the soldiers. He didn't go to the social clubs in Brooklyn where the crews gathered. He didn't attend family dinners. He didn't maintain the personal relationships that kept a mob family cohesive. He summoned people to the White House, like a king granting audiences, and many soldiers resented it deeply. Paul also made a fatal decision early in his reign. He banned family members from dealing in narcotics. Now, on the surface, this seemed reasonable. Drug trafficking brought intense law enforcement scrutiny. Sentences were harsh. The risk-to-reward ratio was problematic. Many old-school mobsters viewed drugs as beneath them, as something that attracted the wrong kind of attention. But the ban was unenforceable, and everyone knew it. Heroin, cocaine, and later crack flooded New York in the late 70s and early 80s. The profits were astronomical. A kilogram of cocaine that cost $5,000 wholesale sold for $50,000 on the street. Soldiers who were making a few $100s a week from loan sharking could make thousands from one drug deal. Paul's solution was to look the other way as long as he got his cut and no one embarrassed the family publicly. This created a culture of hypocrisy. Everyone dealt drugs. Everyone kicked money up to Paul. And everyone pretended to follow the rule. One capo who was particularly successful in the drug trade was John Gotti. Gotti ran a crew in Queens, based out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park. He was 46 years old when Paul became boss, and he represented everything Paul wasn't. Where Paul was refined and distant, John was charismatic and accessible. Where Paul wore conservative business suits, John wore $1,000 custom-tailored outfits. Where Paul avoided the spotlight, John seemed drawn to it. John Gotti was born in the Bronx in 1940, the fifth of 13 children in a desperately poor family. He'd dropped out of school at 16 and started running errands for local mobsters. He'd worked his way up through hijacking, theft, and eventually murder. He'd been arrested multiple times, served prison sentences, and earned his reputation as a tough guy who didn't back down. But John was also smart, at least street smart. He understood people. He was generous with his crews, throwing elaborate Christmas parties, helping soldiers with their family problems, creating loyalty through personal connection. His men loved him in a way they never loved Paul Castellano, and John's drug operations were making him rich. His crew, particularly his closest associates like Angelo Ruggiero and Gene Gotti, John's brother, were deeply involved in heroin trafficking. They were making millions of dollars, and while they kicked money up to Paul, they were keeping far more for themselves. The FBI knew all about it. In the early 1980s, they managed to plant a bug in Angelo Ruggiero's house. For months, they recorded conversations. Angelo, who talked constantly and never suspected electronic surveillance, discussed drug deals, murders, and family business in detail. When the FBI finally moved to arrest Angelo and others in Gotti's crew in 1983, they had hundreds of hours of tape. The evidence was overwhelming. Angelo and Gene Gotti were charged with heroin trafficking. The tapes also implicated John Gotti, though he managed to avoid being charged initially. But here's where it got complicated. The surveillance tapes contained conversations about Gambino family business, about murders and other crimes that went far beyond drug trafficking. Paul Castellano, as boss, had the right to review those tapes. He wanted to know what his soldiers had been saying, whether anyone had violated omertà by talking too freely. John Gotti refused to turn over the tapes. He claimed they were privileged, that Angelo's defense lawyers needed them, that they couldn't be shared. But everyone knew the real reason. Those tapes almost certainly contained conversations where Gotti's crew badmouthed Paul, discussed their drug operations, and perhaps even talked about killing the boss. The standoff created a crisis. Paul, feeling disrespected and threatened, began to suspect that Gotti was planning a move against him. Gotti, knowing that Paul had heard rumors about the tapes, began to suspect that Paul might kill him first. Meanwhile, Paul had his own legal problems. In March 1984, federal prosecutors charged him in the Mafia Commission trial, a massive RICO case targeting the leadership of all 5 New York families. The government alleged that the commission itself was a criminal enterprise and that the family bosses had conspired to control industries, fix prices, and order murders. For the first time in mafia history, prosecutors were trying to convict the bosses not for individual crimes, but for the very act of being mob bosses. It was a revolutionary legal strategy, and it was working. Paul's co-defendants included Anthony Fat, Tony Salerno of the Genovese family, Carmine the Snake, Persico of the Colombo family, and others. The trial was scheduled for 1985. If convicted, Paul faced decades in prison. He would die behind bars. The pressure was enormous. Paul knew the government had strong evidence. He knew that his advanced age, he was now 70 years old, meant that even a relatively short sentence was effectively a life sentence. He began to contemplate whether cooperating with authorities might be an option, whether he could cut a deal. This was heresy. Absolute, unthinkable heresy. A boss considering cooperation. It violated every principle the mafia stood for. If word got out, and whispers were starting, Paul would be killed immediately. But Paul wasn't the only one feeling pressure. His underboss, Aniello Della Croce, was dying. Della Croce, now 71 years old, had lung cancer. He'd been the bridge between Paul's white-collar focus and the street soldiers' traditional ways. He'd kept people like John Gotti in line, maintained loyalty through respect and fear. With Della Croce dying, that bridge was collapsing. The family was splitting into factions. The old-timers who respected tradition were dying off. The younger generation, led by people like Gotti, wanted action, wanted respect, wanted a boss who understood their world. Paul made things worse by planning to name his driver, Thomas Bellotti, as the new underboss once Della Croce died. Bellotti was loyal to Paul, but he wasn't respected by the soldiers. He hadn't earned the position through merit. It was pure nepotism, Paul rewarding personal loyalty over family tradition. The decision enraged many capos. John Gotti, who by now was one of the most powerful capos in the family, saw it as an insult. He'd never be underboss under Paul. He'd never advance. And with the tape situation unresolved, he might not even survive. On December 2nd, 1985, Aniello Della Croce died. The one man who could have held the family together was gone. His funeral was attended by hundreds. John Gotti was there, paying respects to a man he genuinely admired. Paul Castellano didn't attend. He was too worried about FBI surveillance at the funeral. He sent flowers instead. It was the final insult. The soldiers saw it as cowardice, as Paul valuing his own comfort over respect for a dying underboss. The resentment that had been building for years reached a breaking point. John Gotti made his decision. Paul Castellano had to die. Gotti reached out to other capos who shared his frustration. Sammy the Bull Gravano, a powerful capo who controlled construction rackets, agreed. So did several others. They couldn't move without permission from the other families, but Gotti had been building relationships. He convinced leaders in other families that Paul was weak, that he might cooperate with the government, that he was bad for everyone's business. It was never officially sanctioned by the commission, but no one moved to stop it either. Paul Castellano had lost respect. In the mafia, that's a death sentence. On the evening of December 16th, 1985, Paul Castellano had a dinner reservation at Sparks Steakhouse, a popular restaurant on East 46th Street in Manhattan. He was meeting with several capos, including Thomas Bellotti, to discuss family business. John Gotti positioned himself nearby, in a car where he could watch without being seen. He brought Sammy Gravano with him. They wanted to witness it personally. 4 shooters were selected. They dressed in identical long coats and Russian-style fur hats. The uniforms made identification difficult and also sent a message. This was organized, professional, sanctioned. At approximately 5:45 p.m., Paul's Lincoln pulled up in front of Sparks. Thomas Bellotti was driving. Paul sat in the passenger seat. As they exited the car, the shooters moved. 6 shots hit Paul Castellano. He fell on the sidewalk, his blood pooling on the concrete. Bellotti tried to react, reaching for a weapon, but he was shot as well. Both men died within seconds. The shooters walked away calmly. Witnesses were too shocked to react. By the time police arrived, the killers had vanished into the Manhattan crowds. John Gotti and Sammy Gravano watched it happen from their car a block away. When they saw Paul fall, they drove slowly past the scene. Gotti stared at his former boss's body. Then he nodded. They drove away. The most powerful boss in America was dead, killed on a busy Manhattan street, shot down like a dog. The Gambino family now belonged to John Gotti, and nothing would ever be the same. Within 2 weeks of Paul Castellano's murder, John Gotti held a meeting of the Gambino family capos. There was no vote, no discussion of alternatives. Gotti simply informed everyone that he was now the boss. Several capos who'd been loyal to Paul considered objecting. Then they looked at the men standing behind Gotti. Sammy Gravano, Frank DeSico, men who'd just orchestrated the murder of the previous boss. The message was clear. Accept John Gotti as boss, or die. Everyone accepted. John Gotti, at 45 years old, now controlled the most powerful crime family in America. And unlike Carlo Gambino, unlike even Paul Castellano, John Gotti had no intention of staying invisible. He loved the spotlight, craved it. Where previous bosses avoided cameras, John posed for them. He dressed in expensive suits that cost $2,000 each. He wore his hair slicked back with gel, perfectly styled. He walked through Little Italy like a celebrity, shaking hands, kissing babies, playing the role of neighborhood benefactor. The media ate it up. Here was a mobster who looked like Central Casting's idea of a gangster. Handsome, charismatic, quotable. Reporters started calling him the Dapper Don for his expensive wardrobe. Later, after he beat several criminal charges, they called him the Teflon Don because nothing stuck to him. John loved the nicknames, loved the attention. He held court at the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, and photographers waited outside to capture him, arriving and leaving. He frequented the same restaurants, tipped extravagantly, and made sure everyone knew who he was. This was the exact opposite of everything Carlo Gambino had taught. Visibility brings scrutiny. Fame brings law enforcement pressure. The more people know your name, the more dangerous your position becomes. But John didn't care. Or more accurately, he thought he was smarter than the FBI. He thought he could play the game, be famous, and still avoid prosecution. And for several years, incredibly, he was right. The Sparks Steakhouse murder was investigated intensively. Everyone knew Gotti had ordered it. The FBI knew. The other crime families knew. But proving it was another matter. The shooters were professionals. No one talked. Witnesses claimed they hadn't seen anything clearly. The case went nowhere. In April 1986, just 4 months after becoming boss, John Gotti was arrested and charged with racketeering. The government had surveillance evidence, testimony from some associates, and a pattern of criminal behavior. It looked like a strong case. Gotti hired the best lawyers. He prepared meticulously. And in March 1987, the jury returned a verdict. Not guilty on all counts. Gotti walked out of the courthouse grinning. He went directly to the Ravenite, where hundreds of supporters waited to celebrate. It was like a victory parade. The Teflon Don had beaten the government. The FBI was humiliated. They'd thrown significant resources at the case and lost. But they didn't give up. They immediately started building another case. In 1988, Gotti was arrested again, this time on charges related to an assault. Again, he beat the case. Again, he celebrated publicly. The pattern was becoming clear. Gotti seemed untouchable. How was he doing it? Several ways. First, Gotti was very careful about what he said and where he said it. Despite his public persona, he knew the FBI was always listening. He spoke in code, in vague references, never directly ordering crimes in ways that could be recorded. Second, he had excellent lawyers who exploited every technicality, challenged every piece of evidence, and created reasonable doubt in juries' minds. Third, and most disturbingly, Gotti was tampering with juries. In his 1986 trial, at least one juror had been approached by Gambino associates and either bribed or intimidated into voting not guilty. The FBI suspected this, but couldn't prove it until years later. And fourth, witnesses were terrified. Testifying against John Gotti was a death sentence. Everyone knew it. Potential witnesses disappeared, changed their stories, or suddenly suffered memory loss on the stand. But Gotti's success was creating a catastrophic problem. The FBI was obsessed with him now. He'd made it personal. They assigned more agents to the Gambino case than to any other organized crime investigation. They used every tool available. They followed him constantly. They pressured his associates. They dug into every business he touched. And they got lucky. In the late 1980s, the FBI managed to plant a bug in the Ravenite Social Club. Not in the main room, which Gotti swept regularly for listening devices, but in an apartment upstairs where Gotti held private meetings. The apartment belonged to the widow of a former mobster, and she'd been convinced, through a combination of pressure and payment, to allow the installation. For months, the FBI recorded conversations. Gotti, feeling secure in what he thought was a clean room, talked freely. He discussed murders, including his role in ordering Paul Castellano's death. He talked about his criminal operations, and crucially, he badmouthed his own underboss, Sammy Gravano. Sammy, the Bull Gravano, had been with Gotti from the beginning. He'd helped plan Castellano's murder. He'd been made underboss after Frank DeCicco was killed in a car bombing in 1986. Sammy was Gotti's right hand, his closest advisor, his most trusted associate. But on the FBI tapes, Gotti complained about Sammy, criticized him, questioned his loyalty, blamed him for problems. It was the kind of talk that in the mafia world signaled that Gotti might be planning to kill Sammy eventually. On December 11th, 1990, the FBI arrested John Gotti, Sammy Gravano, and several other Gambino family members. The charges were extensive: murder, including the Castellano hit, racketeering, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, tax evasion. The government was throwing everything they had at Gotti. But this time, they had something they'd never had before. The Ravenite tapes. Hours of Gotti's own voice discussing crimes. It was devastating evidence. Gotti's lawyers tried to suppress the tapes, arguing they were obtained illegally. The judge disagreed. The tapes were coming in. As the trial approached in 1991, Sammy Gravano made a decision that shocked the entire mafia world. He decided to cooperate with the government. This was unprecedented. Sammy wasn't some low-level associate or fringe member. He was the underboss of the Gambino family. He'd participated in 19 murders. By his own admission, he'd been a made member for decades. He was one of the most powerful mobsters in America, and he was going to testify against John Gotti. The reasons were complex. Sammy had heard the FBI tapes where Gotti badmouthed him. He realized that Gotti, facing life in prison, might try to blame everything on Sammy to reduce his own sentence. He understood that his loyalty to Gotti was not reciprocated, and he'd been offered a deal: testify truthfully, and he'd serve only 5 years in prison for 19 murders. It was a calculation. Sammy chose survival over honor. In doing so, he broke the most sacred rule of La Cosa Nostra: omerta, The Code of Silence. The trial began in January 1992. It was a media circus. Cameras outside the courthouse every day. Reporters filing constant updates. John Gotti arriving in his expensive suits, playing to the cameras, confident he'd beat the charges again. Then Sammy Gravano took the stand. For 9 days, he testified. He described the inner workings of the Gambino family. He detailed murders, including how he and Gotti had planned Castellano's execution. He explained the codes, the rules, the structure of organized crime. He answered every question calmly, matter-of-factly, like he was describing a business rather than a murder syndicate. The jury was riveted. Here was an actual underboss, explaining from inside knowledge how the mafia worked. It was unprecedented access into a world that had always been hidden. Gotti's lawyers tried to discredit Sammy. They called him a liar, a murderer, a man willing to say anything to save himself. But Sammy's testimony was corroborated by the FBI tapes, by surveillance evidence, by documents. Everything he said matched what the government had independently discovered. On April 2nd, 1992, after less than 14 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty. On all counts. The Teflon Don wasn't Teflon anymore. John Gotti had been convicted of murder, racketeering, and conspiracy. He faced life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the verdict was read, Gotti showed no emotion. He stood silently as the judge thanked the jury and dismissed them. Then he was led away in handcuffs. The sentencing came months later. Judge I. Leo Glasser didn't hold back. He called Gotti a ruthless killer who'd corrupted every institution he touched. He noted that Gotti had shown no remorse, no willingness to acknowledge his crimes, and he imposed the maximum sentence: life imprisonment, without parole, to be served in the most restrictive conditions available. Gotti was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, a supermax prison where he was held in 23-hour-a-day, solitary confinement. No contact with other prisoners. Minimal contact with the outside world. The government was ensuring that even from prison, Gotti couldn't run the Gambino family. From his cell, Gotti tried to maintain control. He sent messages through his lawyers and family members. He appointed his son, John Gotti Jr., as acting boss. But it was futile. The FBI monitored everything. Any attempt to run the family from prison was immediately intercepted. The man who'd craved the spotlight, who'd wanted to be famous, who'd believed he was untouchable, spent the rest of his life in a concrete box. No more expensive suits. No more cameras. No more restaurants or social clubs. Just silence and isolation. John Gotti was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1998. The prison provided treatment, but cancer doesn't care about reputation or power. It spread despite chemotherapy and radiation. On June 10, 2002, John Gotti died in a prison hospital. He was 61 years old. He'd spent the last decade of his life in a cage, stripped of everything that had made him feel powerful. His funeral was held in Queens. Hundreds attended, including many who'd feared him and many who'd genuinely loved him. The FBI photographed everyone, of course, adding more faces to their files. John Gotti was buried in a cemetery in Queens, his grave marked with an elaborate monument, much more ostentatious than Carlo Gambino's simple headstone. Even in death, the Dapper Don wanted attention. His legacy was complicated. To some, he was the last of the true gangsters, a man who'd lived and died by the old code even as it destroyed him. To others, he was a cautionary tale, proof that ego and fame are fatal in the underworld. But one thing was certain: John Gotti's reign had nearly destroyed the Gambino family. His need for attention had brought unprecedented law enforcement pressure. His arrogance had led to his underboss becoming a government witness, shattering omerta in a way that encouraged dozens of other mobsters to cooperate. The family survived, but it would never be the same. The age of the celebrity gangster was over. The age of survival had begun. The conviction of John Gotti in 1992 should have been the end of the Gambino family. The government certainly hoped it would be. But organized crime doesn't die easily. It adapts. It survives. And the Gambino family, built over nearly a century, had deep roots that even the most aggressive prosecution couldn't completely destroy. The immediate problem was leadership. With Gotti in prison for life, someone had to run the family. Gotti appointed his son, John Gotti Jr., as acting boss. Jr. was 30 years old, ambitious, and eager to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy. It was a mistake from the beginning. Jr. lacked his father's charisma. He lacked Carlo Gambino's strategic mind, and he lacked any real street credibility. He'd been made a member at 24, unusually young, clearly because of his last name rather than his accomplishments. The older capos resented him. The soldiers didn't respect him. He was, in their eyes, a spoiled kid playing mobster. But Junior was the boss's son, and in the mafia, that still meant something. So the family accepted him, at least publicly, while privately planning around him. The bigger problem was the wave of cooperating witnesses that Sammy Gravano had unleashed. Before Sammy, underbosses didn't flip. Made men didn't testify. The code of omerta was sacred, but Sammy had broken that code and survived. In fact, he'd thrived. His 5-year sentence was remarkably lenient given his 19 admitted murders. He'd been released into witness protection with his family, given a new identity, and essentially rewarded for betrayal. Other mobsters noticed. If an underboss could cooperate and walk away, why couldn't they? The calculation changed. Loyalty to the family versus decades in prison. For many, it wasn't even a difficult choice. Throughout the 1990s, dozens of Gambino family members became government witnesses. Capos, soldiers, associates, all flipping to avoid long sentences. Each one provided information that led to more arrests, which led to more cooperators in a devastating cascade. The FBI developed what they called the cooperation model. Arrest a low-level member, pressure him with evidence and long sentences, offer a deal if he cooperates, use his testimony to arrest higher-ranking members. Repeat the process. Climb the ladder until you've dismantled the entire organization. It was brutally effective. In 1994, Junior Gotti was arrested on racketeering charges. He made bail and continued trying to run the family. But the arrest signaled that the government wasn't satisfied with imprisoning his father. They wanted to destroy the entire Gotti bloodline. Peter Gotti, John's younger brother, took over as acting boss while Junior dealt with his legal problems. Peter was more traditional, less flashy than his brother, but he also lacked John's intelligence and strategic thinking. He was, in many ways, out of his depth. The family's income streams were collapsing. The FBI had infiltrated most of their traditional rackets. Labor racketeering was heavily monitored. Construction unions were cleaned up through federal oversight. The docks, once a Gambino stronghold, were now crawling with federal agents. Gambling operations were raided constantly. The family adapted by going smaller and more diversified. Instead of large, organized operations, they focused on smaller scams. Stock fraud, insurance fraud, credit card schemes, internet-based crimes. It was less profitable, but also less visible. In 1999, Junior Gotti was convicted of racketeering. He was sentenced to over 6 years in federal prison. Before reporting to prison, he allegedly made a decision that shocked his father. He told family members he was retiring from the mafia, walking away, leaving the life. John Gotti, isolated in his supermax cell, was reportedly furious. His son, his chosen successor, was quitting. But Junior had done the math. The FBI would never leave him alone. Every business he touched would be investigated. Every associate would be pressured to flip. He would spend his life in and out of courtrooms and prisons. It wasn't worth it. Junior served his sentence and was released in 2004. True to his word, he attempted to leave the life. The government didn't believe him. They indicted him 3 more times over the next several years, each time claiming he was still involved in Gambino family activities. Each trial ended in a mistrial, with juries unable to reach unanimous verdicts. Finally, in 2009, prosecutors gave up. Junior Gotti walked away. Meanwhile, the family had cycled through several acting bosses. Peter Gotti took over officially after Junior's retirement, but he lasted only until 2002 when he was arrested on racketeering charges. He was eventually convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison, where he would die in 2021 at age 81, never having been released. The constant leadership turmoil was devastating. The family had no clear direction, no long-term strategy, no respected boss who could unite the various crews. It was survival mode, day by day, trying to make money while avoiding the FBI. But even in decline, the Gambino family remained dangerous. They were still the largest of the 5 families, with an estimated 150 to 200 made members and over 1,000 associates. They still controlled certain industries, still collected protection money, still loaned money at extortionate rates, still murdered people who crossed them. The difference was scale. Where Carlo Gambino's family had generated hundreds of millions annually, the modern version generated maybe tens of millions. Still significant, but a fraction of their former power. In 2005, the family appointed Arnold Squitieri as acting boss. Squitieri was old school, having been made back in the 1970s. He tried to restore some discipline and structure, but within a year, he too was arrested and eventually convicted. He received a 7-year sentence. The FBI's strategy was clear: arrest the leadership constantly. Even if convictions took years, keep them tied up in court, unable to run the family effectively. Bankrupt them with legal fees. Force them to appoint new bosses every few years, preventing anyone from consolidating power. It was working. The Gambino family was still operational, but barely functional. The glory days of Carlo Gambino, when the family operated with corporate efficiency, seemed impossibly distant. In 2007, the family made an interesting choice. They appointed Domenico Cefalù as official boss. Cefalù, known as Italian Dom, was 70 years old, a traditional mobster who'd managed to avoid major convictions throughout his career. He was the opposite of John Gotti: quiet, careful, invisible. It was, in a way, a return to Carlo Gambino's philosophy. Stop attracting attention. Stop giving the FBI targets. Operate quietly, carefully, and survive. Cefalù kept a remarkably low profile. He didn't hold court at social clubs. He didn't grant interviews. He barely appeared in public. The FBI knew he was the boss but struggled to build cases against him. He was, like Carlo before him, trying to become smoke. By 2008, the Gambino family was unrecognizable from its peak. Membership was down. Income was down. Influence was down. Young people weren't joining like they used to. The mystique was gone. Being in the mafia in 2008 meant constant surveillance, high risk of prison, and relatively modest profits. But they survived. Against all odds, through decades of prosecutions, through the betrayal of dozens of cooperating witnesses, through the destruction of their leadership, the Gambino family endured. They learned to operate in the shadows again. They learned that Carlo Gambino had been right all along. Invisibility is power. Silence is survival. The FBI had won many battles. They'd imprisoned dozens of mobsters, seized millions in assets, and severely damaged the organization. But they hadn't won the war. The Gambino family was still out there, smaller and quieter, but alive. And in the underworld, survival is its own kind of victory. If you walked through certain neighborhoods in Brooklyn or Queens today, you might pass a Gambino family member on the street and never know it. That's exactly how they want it. The modern Gambino family bears little resemblance to the organization John Gotti led. There are no celebrity bosses, no expensive suits and staged photographs, no social clubs where tourists take pictures. The family has returned to what Carlo Gambino always knew worked best: invisibility. Current law enforcement estimates suggest the Gambino family maintains approximately 150 to 200 made members, with perhaps 1,000 associates. This makes them still the largest of New York's 5 families, though far smaller than their peak in the 1980s, when they had over 300 made members. The family's structure remains traditional: a boss, an underboss, a consigliere, and numerous capos who run individual crews. But the identities of leadership are often unclear. The FBI believes that as of 2024, A mobster named Lorenzo Menino serves as official boss, though this is disputed, and Menino himself would certainly never confirm it. The uncertainty is intentional. By keeping leadership ambiguous, the family makes it harder for law enforcement to target anyone specific. If prosecutors can't definitively prove who's giving orders, it's difficult to build RICO conspiracy cases. The family's revenue sources have evolved dramatically. Traditional rackets like labor racketeering and dock control are heavily monitored and less profitable. Instead, the modern Gambino family has diversified into areas that are harder to detect and prosecute. Cybercrime has become significant. Credit card fraud, identity theft, online gambling, and cryptocurrency scams generate substantial income with lower risk of violent confrontation. A soldier with a laptop can steal more money than one with a gun, and if caught, the sentences are often shorter than for traditional crimes. The opioid epidemic created opportunities. While old-school bosses banned drug dealing, modern reality is different. Heroin, fentanyl, and prescription painkillers generate enormous profits. The family is involved, though carefully, using layers of insulation between leadership and street-level dealers. Construction and waste management remain family strongholds, though the methods are more sophisticated. Instead of obvious extortion, they use shell companies, bid rigging, and strategic partnerships with legitimate businesses. On paper, everything looks legal. Proving criminal enterprise requires years of investigation. The family has also expanded geographically. While New York remains home base, Gambino crews operate in Florida, particularly in Miami and Tampa. They have connections in Las Vegas, Los Angeles, and even internationally in Canada and Italy. The globalization of crime mirrors the globalization of legitimate business. But the family faces challenges that Carlo Gambino never imagined. Electronic surveillance is ubiquitous. Cameras are everywhere. Financial transactions leave digital trails. Cell phones are tracking devices. The FBI has tools that make old-fashioned police work seem primitive. The family has adapted through compartmentalization. Information flows vertically but not horizontally. A soldier in one crew might not know what another crew is doing. Made members avoid discussing business electronically. Face-to-face meetings happen in random locations, while walking, where bugs can't reach. They've also learned from past mistakes. No more celebrity bosses. No more public displays. When a member is arrested, others stay away from the courthouse. When someone is convicted, there are no big funerals or public mourning. Everything happens quietly. The biggest challenge is recruitment. Young Italian Americans today don't join the mafia like they did in Carlo's era. They go to college. They become legitimate businessmen, lawyers, doctors. The economic desperation that once drove people to organized crime has largely disappeared from Italian American communities. The family recruits differently now. They're less focused on ethnic background and more on capability. Associates come from various backgrounds. What matters is earning potential and reliability, not heritage. On March 13th, 2019, something happened that shocked the underworld. Frank Calli, believed to be the Gambino family boss, was shot and killed outside his home in Staten Island. He was struck 10 times and run over by a vehicle. It appeared to be a classic mafia hit, a message killing. But the truth was stranger. The killer was a 24-year-old conspiracy theorist who believed Calli was part of a deep state cabal. It had nothing to do with mob business. Calli's death was almost accidental, the result of online radicalization and mental illness rather than organized crime. The incident revealed how much had changed. The Gambino family couldn't even control violence against its own leadership anymore. Random civilians posed threats that traditional security couldn't prevent. After Calli's death, the family appointed new leadership, though again, the exact chain of command remains deliberately unclear. The organization continues operating, generating income, managing its interests, and avoiding prosecution. Federal law enforcement still monitors the Gambino family closely. The FBI's Gambino squad maintains active investigations. They make arrests periodically. In 2017, they indicted several members on racketeering charges related to construction fraud. In 2021, more arrests followed, these related to illegal gambling and loan sharking. But these are tactical victories. not strategic ones. The family replaces arrested members. The business continues. For every conspiracy the FBI disrupts, others operate undetected. The modern Gambino family will never achieve the power Carlo Gambino wielded. Those days are gone, ended by RICO statutes, electronic surveillance, and the collapse of Omerta. The family operates now in a much more constrained environment, more like a mid-sized criminal enterprise than an empire. But they endure. That's worth noting. Through a century of wars, prosecutions, betrayals, and leadership failures, the Gambino family survives. It's smaller, quieter, less influential, but still operational. Compare this to Mexican cartels or Russian organized crime groups, which have grown exponentially in the same period the mafia declined. The difference is environmental. Those organizations operate in regions with weaker law enforcement, more corruption, and greater public desperation. The American mafia faces the full weight of the most sophisticated law enforcement apparatus in the world. That they survive at all is testament to the foundation Carlo Gambino built. The structure he created, the principles he established, the network he developed, they proved resilient enough to withstand decades of assault. In Brooklyn today, there are still social clubs where old men play cards and drink espresso. There are still restaurants where certain people get the best tables. There are still neighborhoods where everyone knows the rules, where certain businesses pay certain people, where disputes are settled quietly. The Gambino family didn't end. It didn't surrender. It didn't disappear. It just learned to hide again. Like Carlo always knew it should. The empire built by a Sicilian boy who arrived with nothing. The empire that controlled the most powerful city in the world. The empire that survived world wars and FBI wars and its own self-destruction. That empire still exists. You just can't see it anymore. And that's exactly how they want it. From the poorest villages of Sicily to the shadows of modern New York, the Gambino family has endured for over a century. 5 generations. Countless wars. Hundreds of arrests. Dozens of betrayals. They've been led by brilliant strategists like Carlo Gambino and reckless showmen like John Gotti. They've controlled billions of dollars and influenced governments. They've murdered hundreds and corrupted thousands. This isn't a story with a clean ending. The Gambino family still exists today, operating quietly in the same neighborhoods where Carlo once walked, following the same principles he established 70 years ago. Invisibility, patience, survival. Were they heroes? Absolutely not. They were criminals who built their empire on violence, extortion, and fear. But were they fascinating? Undeniably. Their story reveals how power actually works, how organizations survive, how ambition and ruthlessness can build empires that last generations. The next time you walk through Little Italy or Bensonhurst, remember, the Gambino family is still out there. You just can't see them anymore. Thanks for joining me on this journey through America's most powerful crime dynasty. Sleep well, and remember, the most dangerous power is the power you never see.